Bonjour. Monsieur adjoint au maire de la ville de Cachan pour l'enseignement secondaire et supérieur, chers 10 étudiants, monsieur Hervé Boulem, chère Marianne Daffy-Briguière, et chers invités, collègues et coparticipantes à cette édition de CIPSH Academy, mesdames et messieurs. Tout d'abord, compte tenu du contexte, je voudrais demander à nos distingués invités la permission d'abandonner un instant la langue française afin que mes propos soient compris par l'ensemble de l'auditoire. Donc je compterai néanmoins, j'espère, sur la traduction simultanée de mon discours en espérant que l'intelligence artificielle soit suffisamment intelligente pour passer mon message en même temps que j'arrive à déguiser mon mauvais français. So, now in English. So it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome you all here at Excel Business School at this inaugural session of the 2025 CIPSH Academy. We are starting today 4 days of intense discussions, debates and visits concerning the topics of waterscapes management from a Chinese and global perspective. Before we proceed with the program, I would like to invite you to reflect on 3 questions. Why is this topic relevant? Why now? And why here? Starting with the first question, why is waterscapes management relevant? Why are these contrasting perspectives important? We should look at the existential value of water, be it expressed in terms of scarcity, coastal erosion, pollution, if we want to cite just but a few examples. If these may be seen as problems better approached by what is called the exact sciences, it would be irresponsible to set aside humanities. In fact, humanities address the fundamental factor that can be seen both as the source of the problem and its solution: people. People and their relationship with the territory, people and their capacity to transform territory into landscape. Only through the humanities can we understand and explain the cumulative choices made by the successive communities that have been using and appropriating water sources in the mountains, exploring river banks and its resources, populating lakes and seashores, navigating the oceans. Only through the humanities can we try to understand the set of beliefs, values, and practices that today shape our actions and lead us to the overexploitation of resources in what seems to be a suicidal movement towards excess. Humanities work with these often intangible assets, sets of beliefs, values, narratives, in a world culture, to explore new terrains left unanswered by the exact sciences. Humanities start from the imagined to understand the symbolic, from the symbolic to understand the sacred, and from the material to the material that slowly carve the existing lands and waterscapes. Humanities have the capacity to go deep in the depth of our collective ethos, to unearth the reasons leading to the overexploitation of water on one extreme, its deification on another, and the many uses and appropriation of water sources in between. Humanities have the tools to explain the links and boundaries between anthropo and natural systems. In this context, a humanities interpretation of waterscapes emerges as a reflexive tool directed both at the past, taking stock of the cumulative effects of the relationship between humans and water, and the future, depicting imagined futures in the context of scarcity and sustainability, thus contributing to furthering our understanding of waterscapes as a product of cultural agency that needs to be properly managed. Debating Chinese and global perspectives is likely to bring to the fore fruitful ideas and novel contributions to the theory and practice of cultural waterscapes management due to the different understandings of the relationship between anthropo and natural systems characterizing different intellectual and cultural traditions. Indeed, while the industrial era inaugurated a period of anthropocentric domination in which nature is seen as a resource to be explored and exploited by humanity, an historical perspective over pre-modern times, both in China and elsewhere, seemed to posit a symbiotic relationship between two equally important elements of unique ecosystem. At a time where there are increasing calls to the latter type of relationship, the legacies of traditional cultures, including the Chinese, offer important resources for humanity to establish a necessary balance with nature. Now, the second question I would like to raise concerns time and opportunity. Why now? Well, today we are witnessing the co-occurrence of two phenomena that, when put together, are quite concerning. From one side, we witness the evident effects of global warming, of the overuse of resources, of the coastal erosion. We watch the devastation of floods, the consequences of prolonged droughts, the human suffering they are causing. So on one side, there is the very physical manifestation of a chosen path in the relationship between anthropo and natural system. On the other side, we are observing the emergence of a new set of beliefs and values that is rapidly transforming itself into a dominating narrative, justifying practices and attitudes that negate the causal relationship between human action and natural systems reaction. The imagined, the symbolic, is dangerously taking the shape of a dominating cultural response that replaces responsibility with fatality, that chooses to ignore the evidence and replaces it by alternative notions of truth. So why now? Because now is the time to counter this emerging narrative. Now is the moment to revisit the depth of our collective ethos to find a common understanding of the problems shaping and affecting waterscapes management that benefits all regions of the world in a context of systemic integration of both problems and solutions. The CIPSH International Academy of Chinese Cultures and Global Humanities is the liminal space of discussion and sharing that should contribute to diminish the impact of the different interpretive systems on the efforts to pursue viable and sustainable solutions to waterscape management. The third and final question concerns Excelia Business School. Why here? Why a business school to engage in such conversation? Well, businesses and organizations as a whole are responsible for part of the problems we are witnessing today. It is the neoliberal narrative with the myth of illimited growth and the unbridled pursuit of profit maximization, the world grounded in a quasi-mythical rationality that is partially responsible for the overuse of resources, the overproduction and overconsumption we witness today. As such, is the primal obligation of the business school, of the management education, to counter these narratives, to find the middle ground that reinstalls the balance between the societal and natural needs. It is for the business and management schools to find the narrative together with humanities that pushes companies and other organizations towards a respectful and nature-focused attitude, to move from what we call a weak to a strong capability. So to the question of why a business school, I would answer, why not a business school? If we are at the center of the problem and could be at the center of the solution. But why Excelia? Excelia has a long tradition in the field of sustainability. We launched the first Masters in Sustainable Development in France. Pierre, he's here among us, and he launched it, the first Master in Sustainable Development in France, more than 2 decades ago, long before that became the norm. We have developed fundamental research skills and competences in the field with a significant number of publications in the field of CSR, sustainability and water management. We have developed pedagogical tools and instruments that bring water to the fore of the managerial concerns. Some examples are the Blue Education Experience, which pedagogical dimension is likely to have a long-term impact on students' attitudes towards the environment in general and water-related problems in particular. Or we have Climat-Cité, another pedagogical initiative that engages students in a mandatory environmental mission together with companies, NGOs, or other environmental-related organizations. So our history, our competences, Excelia's unique positioning as a responsible actor in sustainable management is what is supporting us to submit a proposal to install a UNESCO chair in cultural waterscapes management at Excelia. And Excelia's UNESCO chair would be focused in moving the discussions we are initiating here today to the world of practice by engaging with local communities and in real societal transformation. This is being done with other academic and non-academic partners. Some of these partners are here with us today in the field of the social and human sciences in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, including CIPSH, Bridges, AFLEA, and other UNESCO-related organizations. So in brief, why this is important? Because humanities have a say in the transformations we are witnessing. Why now? Because these transformations are having immediate consequences and we need to start acting. Why here? Because we at Excelia are a responsible actor that intends to engage into real transformative change. Thank you. Now, before I pass the word to my esteemed friend, Professor Luis Usterbeck, I would like to invite Monsieur Hervé Gulen, the Deputy Mayor for Secondary and Higher Education Research and Student Life of the Cachan City, to say a few words.
Hello everybody, so I'm here. I was invited to welcome you in Cachan. Cachan, as you can see, is a very is a city where there is a lot of structures where you can have education. It's a city of 31,000 inhabitants with more than 6,000 students. As you can see, the city, the campus, the entrance of the campus is not in a very well state. It's because few years ago, the well-known École Normale Supérieure from Cachan and then Paris-Cachan moved to Saclay. And so we can welcome new schools such as Excelia, École Polytechnique Féminine, and there will be a third school that will come in few months. And there is a well-known, but not for people who are studying humanities, but a school of construction which is called ISTP, École Spéciale de Travaux Publics, where there is more than 3,000 students together. For me, the theme is quite known for me. I'm a physicist, and I was studying fluid mechanics. So I could talk about turbulence or chaos, fluid motion, but I don't think it's the most important theme you will heard here. So just these few words to wish you a well stay here in Cachan. The mayor couldn't come today because she has lots of work. So I hope you will have good moments. I have seen that you will visit a bit Paris, some museum. You will discover La Seine. Here in Cachan we have the Bièvre, which is a very small river, but we do not have any boat to frequent it. So welcome and have a nice walk. Thank you very much.
So Luis,
Voilà. I won't be very formal, so thank you very much for being here today, and thank you also. Please convey to the mayor our thanks and gratitude for your support, and I thank the University Excelia, of course, for this. Just a few words about why CIPSH is doing this program for a few years now. The idea of establishing an academy came from a conversation with the former president of CCK Foundation in Taiwan. Back in 2019, we were thinking on how could CCK Foundation, CIPSH, also engaging scholars from different countries, engage in doing something useful for research, for humanities, for universities. And we came also with Professor Shongping Chen and Professor Chao Gojin, who at the time was the president of CIPSH. I was the Secretary General then, to establish this program. The idea, in general terms, is, although we do not endorse the naive understanding of an East-West divide, we do not. We understand there are two things. One, that there are different cultural intellectual traditions. The other one is that there are perceptions in societies of a certain number of divides, among which the East-West. And this is such an old prejudgment that even UNESCO, when it was established in 1945, and then asked CIPSH to be structured in 1949, the first task given by UNESCO to CIPSH was to study the potential interaction and collaboration between the Asian and the Western intellectual traditions, is as if there were only two. So the academy, of course, is not taken as a naive approach that there are the Chinese traditions and the European or whatever. But of course, we are all trained within a certain kind of academic environment. It is true that also for political reasons, many of those who still have responsibilities, I hope this may change for the better in the future, or we never know. But many of us were trained for many years in one of the sides, being cut off of the inputs of the other. So there's a first important idea behind this academy, which is to produce knowledge and to research around a certain kind of themes, which are the different perspectives, if there are, which is the actual complex relation between these different kinds of traditions. A lot of things are written since people like Jaspers and so on in the past thought about it. The second important aim of the academy is that it is independent. So every year a call is open to the members of the academy for proposals, and we've had so far 3 years sessions, 2 online and 1 in presence, talking about global ethics. And there was a first volume published, the second one is in press. There was one on the contribution of arts and the artists to building the idea of the idea of globalization since the 16th century. And this is also coming up as a book very soon, I hope still this year. Last year we had a very interesting seminar, some of you participated in it, on humanities and education, and there were very interesting debates about the Chinese approaches to this and the Greco-Roman European traditions themselves. And this year we have this topic of waterscapes. So one of the important thing is that at least one member organization of CIPSH must be interested. But I'm happy to see that today we have here colleagues from at least 7 different organizations. Afaleia was the one that made the proposal, but we have here colleagues from USPP, myself, so the prehistorians, but we have from Asian Humanities Network, from the International Geographic Union, from the International Union of Academies, from the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, and also from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So, and this is again one of the aims of CIPSH, is to bridge and promote conversations among scholars from different disciplines and with different angles. And we hope that the various seminars eventually may lead to something else. I mean, the something else can be projects, can be initiatives. The sequence of seminars on global ethics had an important consequence in terms of structuring in that direction. The seminar last year, for example, on education marked the beginning of a stronger intervention of CIPSH in the field of education. And we will see. But there is no specific pressure. It's for you and for all of us this week to see if there is an interest on doing something else. One novelty in relation to previous years is that we have started, again with the support of CCK Foundation, a program of young researchers, young scholars in their beginnings of their careers. And we have here Dr. Li from the National Taiwan University, who is the first ever in this program. So thank you very much and congratulations. And I hope this is the beginning of a CIPSH youth, early advanced scholars in the humanities. Then 2 last notes. Why waterscapes? Some of you already know Excelia is discussing the preparation of a proposal of a UNESCO chair on this topic. The reason of that is, of course, the interest of the university, but conversations we had with Professor Nuno Guimarães da Costa on the interests on the side of CIPSH and Afaleia and some other partners in boosting activities and networks in the overall field of landscape studies and the specific contribution of the humanities. So I hope very much that this chair, in which some of you have been working, also John Crowley here, will be successful in the near future. And so this is one important dimension. The way we see the chairs, both UNESCO chairs supported by CIPSH and the CIPSH chair, we have a certain number. Desmond, for example, is chairing one of the CIPSH chairs in this moment, based in Hung Cheng University of Hong Kong. The purpose is to bridge scholars from different fields of the humanities, but also social sciences and also natural sciences. So, and last but not least, Nuno already mentioned about business, the bridge between CIPSH and Excelia, as before that with Hung Cheng University of Hong Kong, is that we think that the reorganization of research at the world level requires resuming the understanding of what humanities are. Humanities have been understood for too long as a narrow field restricted to history, anthropology, and literature. And of course, those are, and philosophy also alongside. And of course, those are the backbones. But these dimensions of history, anthropology, literature, philosophy are present in all the fields of knowledge. This is the origins of university. In the universities, all of us know, in the beginning there would be no education, no courses in engineering or in natural sciences. Those were done. Today we talk about bridging with the corporations and having students going to the private sector and so on. Well, that's what used to be done in the beginning. The university was created so that knowledge could be bound together. And the role of the humanities is actually to bind together the different avenues of knowledge. So in that sense, CIPSH wishes that in the future, colleagues in the field of law, in the field of management, in the field of medicine, we already have from geology, and of course some of our members are by definition across disciplines, geographers for example. So we hope this will become the future of CIPSH. And so this academy also serves for that purpose. So enjoy the week, and enjoy the food, and enjoy the underground.
We have now a video address by the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, Lydia Britt. Because she was not able to join us here, but she recorded a short video that will be shared now with us.
Distinguished participants, it is an honor to join the inaugural session of the 2025 CIPSH International Academy on Chinese Cultures and Global Humanities. The theme, Managing Aquatic Landscapes, Chinese Perspectives and Global Humanistic Approaches, speaks to one of humanity's oldest relationships, our bond with water. For millennia, rivers and coasts have sustained economies, inspired cultures, and carried meanings of renewal and connection. Today, this balance is unbroken, with 40% of the world's population living within 100 kilometers of the coast. Rising seas, shifting rivers, and pollution are transforming aquatic landscapes everywhere. This makes your dialogue essential. By bringing together Chinese perspectives and global humanistic traditions, this academy creates space to compare, confront, and connect different ways of seeing, a step towards shared sustainable solutions. UNESCO is deeply engaged in this work. Through the International Hydrological Program, the World Water Assessment Program, and through our designations, biosphere reserves, geoparks, and all heritage sites, which safeguards landscapes where culture and nature meet. The humanities remind us that water is not only a resource, but also heritage, identity, and belonging. This same spirit drives the most bridge coalition, uniting science, humanities, and communities for sustainability. May your discussions like water flow resiliently and connect us in protecting aquatic landscapes for generations to come. I thank you.
So now we'll have two keynote addresses. So we'll start with John Crowley, CEO of PHGD Group. John, if you want to join us.
I do.
I'll give you the stage until 3.
Until 3.
Until 3.
Dead leg from crossing my legs. Thank you. I like to record myself. This is very old, but it actually records very nicely. Let me see if I can make it work. So I am actually going to be talking about fluid dynamics, but not the Navier-Stokes equations and the general conditions for their smoothness, because if I could give you the answer to that question, they would give me a prize and $1 million to go with it. But at least metaphorically, I will be mentioning issues that are connected to those equations and what they mean. Sorry, I'm waffling while I get this started. So, what I wanted to talk about, with a nod to some literary and musical references, is rivers of constant change and ever-shifting seas, which leads me to the title, The Fluid Dynamics of Culture. And you could equally say the culture of fluid dynamics in this case. And basically, to save time, even though we have until 3 by the generosity of Nuno, I could summarize the whole talk in just 3 sentences, and then we can break for coffee. First, water flows. Secondly, culture is fluid. Third, culture and water therefore have a deep affinity. I thank you. I'm half serious here. That is actually the presentation. But of course, you're interested to see how I can fill it in and justify some of those statements, which are extremely vague. So let me try to do that. And because we are in a humanities-inspired context, let me do so with some literary references, if I can find them. It's very interesting how much metaphorical language about seas and rivers there is in human literature, dating back many millennia. I could have started probably with the Odyssey, which is by definition all about angry seas, personified in an angry god, angry that Odysseus blinded his son, as you know. But I picked a couple of others, one about the sea, one about rivers, because they sound nice, and they're both from books for which I have some literary affection. There will, of course, be a special prize for those who can recognize where the quotation comes from. I won't tell you what the prize is, but listen carefully, and if anyone recognizes the source, raise a hand. First quotation. There is, one knows what, sweet mystery about this sea, whose gently awful stirrings seem to speak of some hidden soul beneath. Now, I'll tell you later. Very famous book. If you don't recognize it, no problem. Secondly, but you note the fact that the sea has spirit and not just movement. There's something about it that speaks to its being more than what we simply see when we look at it. And the same is true for rivers. This is actually harder to get as a quotation and slightly longer, but it sounds nice, so I'll read it in full. And if anyone gets it, you will get a double special prize. He thought his happiness was complete when, as he meandered aimlessly along, suddenly he stood by the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. This sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh, to fling itself on fresh playmates that shook themselves free and were caught and held again. All was a shake and a shiver, glints and gleams and sparkles, rustle and swirl, chatter and bubble. The mole was bewitched, entranced, fascinated. By the side of the river he trotted as one trots, when very small, by the side of a man who holds one spellbound by exciting stories. And when tired at last, he sat on the bank, while the river still chattered onto him. A babbling procession of the best stories in the world, sent from the heart of the earth to be told at last to the insatiable sea. Very literary, very nice. And again, the river isn't just flowing water. It's a storyteller, a place of experience. And this is what I want to talk about here. Sorry, some of this is handwritten, some of it isn't. So the point, as indicated in my abstract, which I'll summarize again and more or less read in full because you may not have had time to see it, water in its multiple forms is the bearer of rich and diverse cultural meanings. And water that flows and shifts, as in the two quotations I just read, and since no one actually got them, the first, by the way, about the sea, is from Herman Melville in Moby Dick. And the second is from Kenneth Grahame's novel The Wind in the Willows, which you may or may not know. The mole was a bit of a giveaway, but no one raised their hand, so the prizes have not been won and will be rolled over to next year's CIPSH Academy. So water that flows and shifts, as we saw in those quotations, and I could have found hundreds more very easily, and I'm sure you can also from Chinese literature about rivers, wetlands and seas, is especially ripe with significance, explored in poetry, literature, philosophy, music for as long as we have traces, and constantly reinvented in more recent media such as photography and film. The diversity of meanings within each culture and across cultures defies any attempt to categorize or systematize, and I won't try to do so. Not least because flowing water and the cycles that connect its various forms are essentially ambivalent. Water brings life to the desert, but it also drowns the sailor and the desperate lost soul. The river provides fish and facilitates transport, but equally may destructively overflow its banks. Having had the pleasure, the opportunity to visit the delta of the Yangtze River on a trip to China a couple of years ago with people who were showing me all about it and how the issues of water management, even today, after millennia of attempts to control the river and make it suitable for cohabitation with humans, is just a reminder of how complex and important these issues are, and how one lives with a river, but one never fully and completely controls it. The ocean may seem gentle and serene, or angrily rear up in crashing waves. And while liquid water is perhaps of special cultural significance, and I'm focusing here on liquid water, its other phases, steam and vapor, and perhaps especially snow and ice, have their own significance explored in the imaginative literature and mythology of the peoples for whom snow and ice in particular are at the heart of their experience of waterscapes. We perhaps don't think of ice as a waterscape, but for the peoples of the Arctic, ice, at least for 6 months of the year, is the characteristic cultural form of the waterscape. What I want to explore is how these physical and cultural experiences of water intertwine. Now, fluid dynamics, as mentioned by someone who knows much more about it than I do, is very literally the subdiscipline within physics that analyzes how water flows, water and other fluids, of course, but in particular, in this case, water. As I mentioned, it's governed by equations that have no general solution, and which encapsulate the physical tensions between the smooth, the steady, and the laminar within the ways in which water can flow, and the turbulent, the chaotic, and the unpredictable. And at the same time, fluid dynamics, taken this time metaphorically rather than literally, is precisely the framing on which cultural meanings attach their tendrils. Water matters and is interpreted poetically, mythologically, visually, in terms of the interplay between the fluid and the dynamic, at the ever-shifting frontier between the material and the symbolic. And yet at the same time, and inseparably, water is subject to technological control, and has been for many centuries. It's just that since the 19th century we've done more of it, as we have in other areas too, such as energy, for instance. Water is tamed for transport, for aquaculture, for energy production, for tourism, and for multiple other human objectives, all of which involve reducing and mastering the inherent dynamics, of the fluid, at the risk of something wrong with this, probably because the battery is too weak, yeah. All of which involve reducing and mastering the inherent dynamics of the fluid at the risk of erasing its cultural fascination, just as other kinds of cultural landscapes are hollowed out by subjection to the extraction of value. Everything can be Disneyfied, if we want to take that rather simple way of putting it. So the essence of what we call a waterscape in the context of this academy, in the context of the chair proposal that Nuno and I are working on for submission to UNESCO, as was mentioned earlier, and in other contexts as well, is that encounter between fluidity and fixity, between function and meaning. Now, does it follow from that that no waterscape can exist that is not culturally encoded? This is perhaps the essential question of the whole meeting, and while at one level you could say it's just a matter of arbitrary definition, maybe we can define waterscape as water plus culture, and if we define it that way, then by definition we have resolved the question. There's also, I think, a deep historical resonance here. It goes back to the old story about when a tree falls in the forest and no one sees it, did it actually fall? The central conundrum of empirical philosophy in the 18th century British tradition. Does it have to be seen to actually happen? When a wave crashes on a shore untrod by human foot, somewhere in Antarctica, for instance, unobserved by human eye, though there may be many penguins looking on, uncharted by any map. We've moved that past that point. Everything is charted now. Does it crash somehow differently? Does it crash pre-culturally? That's a trickier question than it sounds. And in my view, at least for the purposes of this presentation and within the terms of what I'm trying to say to you, paradoxical as it may seem, the answer is no. Not because the ocean is concerned by how it's perceived, but because the imaginative experience of the unseen wave is at the heart of how the ocean is perceived and valued, as precisely something dynamic, wild, fluid, turbulent, that matters precisely insofar as it is untamed, and to paraphrase Melville as quoted earlier, to the extent to which lurk within its depths unseen creatures, strange forces, and mysteries. However, the unseen wave is a limiting case, a kind of vanishing asymptote, the cultural implicit of the concrete experience of the waterscape. As I mentioned, there's hardly anywhere that's uncharted these days, even though some shores may be untrod and some waves may crash unseen. For generations, in places for millennia, seas, rivers, and oceans have been tamed for human purposes. And this, of course, is the point of our title, Waterscapes Management, as we see on the screen. A waterscape is something experienced and at the same time something created. Created not just to be experienced, but also in one way or another to be exploited. And exploited is a very vague term. Simply to sail on the sea is to, in a very general sense, exploit it, but perhaps not in an extractivistic, transformative way. But still, it is to use the sea as appropriate for some human purpose, getting from A to B with one's cargo, or perhaps simply exploring or fishing. This relationship between experience and exploitation is dynamic, just as is the water that is being experienced and exploited. Examples of the interplay are easy to find. Take beaches. Many of you may enjoy lying on beaches watching the sunset. And even those who don't have seen the photographs, because we live in a world that is pre-experienced through social media photographs, even before being directly experienced physically through eye, ear, and nose. Many beaches, as you know, are ultimately artificial. In France, for instance, the history of beach tourism, on which there's an extensive literature, is intimately connected with two things. The cult of fresh air, which was largely invented by the English aristocracy in the 1820s and 1830s, and the railway, which made coasts that were previously wild and inaccessible, easily accessible to the prosperous urban classes, who had reason to want to enjoy the fresh air, believing it to be beneficial to health. And around fresh air coastal tourism rose up a whole economy of leisure, of which, interestingly, one of the most striking embodiments in France, but in much of Europe, is gambling. Casinos grew up in seaside towns. This is why the Principality of Monaco, to this day, is far more important than its very small size would indicate. Because while casinos were still banned in France, it had a window of opportunity between the arrival of the railway and the legal authorization of casinos in other French coastal towns, like Deauville, Biarritz, and so on, to have a monopoly on gambling within French territory, broadly understood. Now, casinos, very interesting story, not the story of this presentation. Beaches are the story of this presentation. And it's very interesting when you visit coastal towns and do a bit of digging in local history to discover that beaches weren't the reason why people came. They were created once people were coming in order to give them something to do and to look at. La Baule, for instance, I don't know if you know La Baule on the Atlantic coast of France, has the longest sand beach in Europe. It is entirely artificial. It was created in the 1870s as a deliberate project of coastal transformation in order to establish La Baule, which had recently received the blessing of a railway station, with the capacity to benefit from the new traffic. And the technological project of creating a beach, not from nothing, of course, there were bits and pieces of a beach that pre-existed, but the vast transport of sand, the planting of trees to stabilize sand dunes, the concrete and stone infrastructures that were put in place to protect the beach against coastal erosion, all of this was a deliberate project of coastal transformation. And there are many examples in France and elsewhere. So beaches are ultimately artificial, not everywhere, but in many places, created to respond to the social demand for that specific kind of tourism, and it's endured, of course. 19th century beach tourism was very different from the way in which we experience beaches today, but there has been a continuity and a continued fascination with lying on sand under the sun close to the ocean, despite all the health warnings about how bad it is for one's skin. And all the problems of ocean pollution that arise from the creams people put on their skin to protect themselves against the dangerous sun. Despite all of that, and despite a certain decline in the fashion of looking cooked in polite society, we've actually, to some extent, if any of you have teenage children, you know this, come back to the idea that looking pale is actually a sign of higher social status than looking dark, something that in Asia has never gone away as a social norm. Despite all of that, we continue to have that social demand for a specific kind of tourism, which requires not just creating but maintaining beaches. Because, coming back to fluid dynamics again, beaches, sand beaches, are incredibly dynamic environments. They are constantly washed away and recreated in very unpredictable ways. Unpredictable ways that are incompatible with the social, economic, administrative organization of tourism. If you are a beach town, you want the beach in the same place this year as it was last year. That doesn't come naturally. Everything I'm saying is blindingly obvious. But in a context like this, it's perhaps useful to restate the blindingly obvious, just to remind ourselves of how much work goes into producing natural environments, particularly for tourist purposes. But now that beaches have become familiar, they become sites of cultural experience, with all the important issues of technological protection against sea level rise, ocean intrusion, and so on that I just mentioned. Look at how often beaches are photographed. Look at the passion for seeing sunsets from the beach so long as it faces west. There is a cultural context that goes beyond what one does with beaches in the daytime sun. There is winter use of beaches, which is very culturally connected to fresh air and walking and dogs and horses, or kites. In the north of France, the main winter use of beaches is flying kites, which has become a very popular pastime. There's actually a world kite competition every year in Berck-sur-Mer, which, if you know the northern part of France, is a vast sandy expanse on what the English call the English Channel. The French don't call it that, as you can imagine. And I say nothing, but again, if you have teenage kids, you know all about it, about what teenagers do with beaches at night, but we won't go there. Similarly, canals are perhaps the ultimate artificialization of rivers or flows between rivers. Nothing could be more artificial than a canal, dead straight across a flat landscape, enclosing flowing water within concrete walls, typically connecting two rivers for the purpose of transport. And in the industrial geography of Europe from the 18th century, canals were an absolutely crucial aspect of the web of transport between places, allowing industries to develop inland and still be connected to major seaports, something that was crucial to the early Industrial Revolution. One of the most famous early canals in history, which transformed the industrial geography of a whole region, is the Manchester Ship Canal, which connects my home city, Liverpool, to Manchester. Without that canal, many aspects of the Industrial Revolution, particularly the organization of the Industrial Revolution around cotton, would never have happened. Everyone knows this. But through familiarity and changes in industrial geography, in particular the virtual disappearance along many traditional canals of industrial transport, whether of raw materials or finished goods, the canals have become sites of cultural heritage and indeed of slow tourism. Reinventing the canal, which was created to facilitate rapid, cheap transport of heavy materials, into something that now serves to slow down tourists who have become frustrated by the excessive speed of mass tourism. Ask people how they perceive canals today in any European country, and they probably won't talk about coal and iron ore and the Industrial Revolution. They will talk probably about the peaceful experience of a slow holiday. People working on canals in the 19th century would have been very confused if we could bring them to hear that discourse today. So what has been constructed economically and technologically becomes endowed by the mere fact of repeated experience and transformations of the conditions of experience with cultural meaning. And we could continue, of course, and there are so many examples that it will get a bit boring just to list example after example. But one very important example that many of you are certainly familiar with is port regeneration. In all the parts of the world, many of them in Europe, but also in North America, where major port cities have ceased to be major port cities, usually because the historical city center ports have been abandoned in favor of out-of-town container ports, which handle just as much traffic, but with far fewer people working there and a much different industrial geography, leaving the old ports to rot. This is a particular problem in the UK, where ports like Liverpool, Manchester, London were literally decaying in the 1970s. Unused because replaced by newer technology, in the heart of the city, and therefore constituting a form of urban blight, and at the same time absolutely central to the historical memory of what the city meant to itself and to the world. And port regeneration has become one of the driving forces of heritage tourism in all three of the cities I mentioned, and many more besides. In North America, if you know the city of Baltimore, you will perhaps also have seen how the port area has been completely reinvented as a leisure facility, using the remarkable brick buildings that the Industrial Revolution created and repurposing them into housing and entertainment facilities, so that a port which originally served to completely transform a natural landscape into something suitable for the purposes of industrial capitalism now becomes the site of post-capitalist entertainment, building on that physical heritage but redefining it in profoundly different ways. And indeed, I hope that in the course of our explorations of waterscapes in the Chair project that Nuno and I are working on, which has defined one of its horizons as reflecting on new kinds of museums and museification of waterscapes, questions such as those, the question of how ports are reconfigured for new purposes and new cultural meanings, will come to be important. And delta and wetland management, as I mentioned with reference to China, other countries have the same experience, is a constructed landscape over many centuries of dynamic coexistence with a valuable and dangerous river, which has created forms of heritage which are inseparably cultural and technological. And even the tendency in river management in many parts of the world, particularly strong in China, to encourage wetlands, including urban wetlands, as a mode of cohabitation, what's sometimes called sponge cities. In other words, cities that use green spaces within the core of the city as a way of absorbing the risks of river overflow without damage to built infrastructure, but without needing to channel the river excessively for reasons that are partly technological, because over-channeled rivers are safe until they cease to be safe, and when they flood, they're actually more dangerous than naturally flowing rivers, and also because of the perception that rivers should be flowing a bit more freely, because a free-flowing river has the kind of cultural meaning that was referred to in my Kenneth Graham quote. It's not just a canal. A river is more than a canal. As it happens, I'll just do a plug for this, I sit on the jury of an international prize called the LivCom Prize for Livable Communities, the secretariat of which is based in Beijing. and which awards prizes every year. The next prize ceremony is just in a few weeks in Turkey, to cities that have supposedly admirable sustainable development policies, as judged by the jury of which I'm part, so of course they're admirable because we said they were. And a number of prizes have been given in recent years to Chinese cities on major rivers, precisely because of the quality of the efforts they've made to transform flood management from concrete to sponge, from concrete to green areas. And it works. It works including in the purely technological engineering sense of infrastructure vulnerability to flooding. Because flooding is always going to happen. And you never know exactly when it's going to happen. And therefore, infrastructure needs to be protected or recognized to be vulnerable and built in ways that include the vulnerability. If you've ever seen the photos of the 1910 floods in Paris, you know how vulnerable central Paris is to flooding. This is a major concern for public authorities because many highly important sites, you'll probably see this when you visit the river later, are within just meters of the riverbank. I don't know if you see the Ministry of Finance in our trip later. The Ministry of Finance is literally built on the river. If the river floods, then much of the Ministry of Finance will be underwater. Now, many people might say that's a good thing, and ministries of finance should be definitively flooded, perhaps, in order to let the economy and society prosper. But even if you're radically opposed to the very idea of a Ministry of Finance, the fact that it's in such a physically vulnerable position is quite interesting. And the Louvre is within, what, 80 meters of the riverbank, and would be underwater if the river flooded as it did in 1910. There's a very complex plan to protect the collections if that happens. I think they can evacuate basically the whole storage space of the Louvre within 48 hours. But it's a massive undertaking, and you have to plan for it. Anyway, the point here is that we might dream of a kind of blank slate, blank slate. And we often do when we think about environmental protection, from which we could redefine a new form of sustainability, economic and technical sustainability of waterscape exploitation, combined with cultural sustainability of waterscape experience. We can just drop the past. Industrial capitalism, traditional uses of water, just forget that. We can start from scratch. We can redefine technocratically, maybe by negotiation in New York, a global waterscape plan, perhaps entrusted to the management of UNESCO, where these sustainability objectives would be achieved. There are two things wrong with that idea. The first is that it's simply ridiculous, because the whole point is to move away from that kind of technocratic top-down framework, but also it misses the point about what is to be protected, and indeed even what is to be exploited. The extreme form of this has become popular in the literature under the name of abandonment or renunciation. It's particularly popular in France. Dismantling is also sometimes used as a word. There's a whole literature in the ecological sciences on the more radical wing of ecology about démantèlement, renonciation, abandon, dismantling, renunciation, abandonment, which is very interesting. They're basically making the point that if we think we can preserve everything, we are condemned to fail. And one of our challenges in order to ensure a more sustainable world is to learn when and where to let go. There are some examples of this in history. I don't know if you know Iceland. If you know Iceland at all, and if you can visualize the map of Iceland, which isn't on the screen, you know that Iceland is basically a kind of quasi-circle with rabbit ears sticking up in the west towards Greenland. And those kind of rabbit ears form two interconnected peninsulas. The westernmost peninsula is still inhabited. The easternmost of the two peninsulas at the far west of Iceland was deliberately abandoned in 1971. It was sparsely inhabited by people with huge, yeah, great. Yeah, well, rabbit ears, okay, yeah, you see. Anyway, the westernmost is still inhabited. The easternmost is abandoned. Not because it wasn't inhabited, not because people gradually left, but because a deliberate decision was made. So basically everything to the northwest of Gjögur, abandoned by deliberate decision. About 400 people were relocated, so it was very sparsely inhabited, because it was judged, one, the logistics of supplying these people with food and fuel were absolutely unmanageable. Two, the people were living in very poor conditions, and the cost of giving them good living conditions was absolutely disproportionate. And three, because there was a desire to create a wilderness, a natural reserve in particular for birds. So there are some very interesting examples. Some small islands have also been abandoned, sometimes deliberately, in a planned way. And the people writing about these issues are essentially arguing that we should be doing this more often. A good example is certain coastal environments. The coast is crumbling in many parts of the world, crumbling as a consequence of sea level intrusion and over technological protection. Too much concrete, which has modified natural rhythms, creating more vulnerability, in fact, in ways that we now understand were predictable, but weren't predicted when the various barriers were put in place. You can, of course, always build higher seawalls to protect the coast further. But maybe at some point you can ask the question, should we keep trying? What's the calculus here? What is the reasonable decision when it becomes incredibly expensive to protect a coast, which is destroyed by being protected because it becomes simply concrete? What if we abandoned it and let it not exactly return to a natural state, but at least decay from the point that it's reached? That is the question of renunciation, which isn't limited to coasts, of course, or to remote Icelandic peninsulas. It can also be applied, say, to industrial facilities and other kinds of built environments. But as you can see, even here, this isn't really related to the idea of a pristine wilderness as it framed the first phase of environmental protection, particularly in the US, particularly the movement led by Aldo Leopold to create natural parks which were devoid of human inhabitation and indeed devoid of human impact. The idea of the wilderness, which is very much a North American, not a European idea, was central, but refers to something very different. Here we're talking not about a wilderness untouched by human hands, but about a transformation of the dynamic relations between humans and their environments, and in this case, their waterscapes. Of course, there's no doubt that the dynamic forces of the hydrological cycle can quite rapidly transform a made environment, such as a beach, a coastline, a flood-prone river delta. The transformation will be fairly quick, and things that were built there and are not sustainable will crumble and collapse if they are left to crumble and collapse. But it won't return it to a pristine, untouched state. It will transform it, not return it, into a new hybrid state that is defined, among other things, by the protocols and mechanisms that have been put in place to abandon it. Abandonment is not doing nothing, it's doing something. And that, I think, is the key point, which some in the literature recognize, some perhaps recognize insufficiently. We could get into that, it's a whole very interesting discussion. And perhaps more importantly, abandonment, rewilding, and the other projects that are proposed as alternatives to exploiting waterscapes in order to experience them, are themselves cultural projects. But the characteristic, coming back to what I said at the beginning about the unseen wave crashing on the untrod shore, is that they value vicarious experience. I don't know if everyone knows the word vicarious. Vicarious is literally what a vicar is. You know what a vicar is, right, in the Church of England? Or perhaps you don't. A vicar is someone who stands for God on earth. Not God. An intermediary, a representative. And what is vicarious is what is experienced at one remove, through something that represents what is experienced, rather than being the thing itself. What I call vicarious experience here is the pleasure or satisfaction of experiencing the decision to renounce experience and imagining what you can't experience, and thereby imaginatively experiencing it. There are many people who have this kind of relationship to Antarctica, for instance, and indeed it drove the decision, which was largely based on geopolitical considerations, but also on aesthetic and moral considerations, to conclude an international convention in 1959 that basically banned industrial, commercial, and military activity in Antarctica, restricting it to a zone of scientific interest that would be open only to internationally collaborative scientific projects. It hasn't quite worked that way, of course, because states are states, but nonetheless it's worked to a considerable extent along those lines. And there are many people who would say, perhaps many in this room, I'd be curious to see who would say this, I would never go on a cruise to Antarctica. The whole point of Antarctica is that you don't go there. But I value Antarctica as not being experienced. Some of the same people might say we should not colonize the moon. The whole point is not to go there. We can look up, as we did last night, and see the full moon. Beautiful full moon in Paris last night. But the whole point is not to spoil it by actually going there. We need that vicarious experience because it's actually the experience that is most aesthetically pleasing and morally defensible. In addition, human experience as an integral part of natural rhythms, coming now to waterscapes, not Antarctica or the moon, is now recognized as a dimension of non-extractive waterscapes. This is particularly true for the experiences of indigenous peoples, but not limited to that experience. As you probably know, in an earlier phase of environmental management, it was very common, and there are a number of very deeply problematic experiences of this in Africa, to expel humans from natural reserves in order to protect those natural reserves as natural, as if the humans living in them weren't natural. This is now regarded as inappropriate and unacceptable, and indeed in the guidelines of UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere program, which was founded in 1972, it's actually considered very important to maintain human activity within the area of a biosphere reserve, but only on the condition that that human activity is an organic part of the reserve, not something that is introduced to the reserve in order to exploit it. In other words, eye on the watch and giving you a little bit of time to react. Waterscapes are a responsibility, not just a set of natural facts, interesting though the natural facts might be. A responsibility to history, no blank slate. A responsibility to cultural meaning. Waterscapes aren't just about water. They're about humans, their eyes, their ears, and their imaginations too. But also to the dynamics of water itself. Because every time we try to shape a waterscape, ignoring the dynamics of the hydrological cycle, we get it wrong. We build infrastructure that doesn't survive. We destroy ecosystems that were of enormous value. Let's explore together, in this academy, the implications of that responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Since we are a little bit ahead of time, I propose that we do a 5 minutes break
Oh, I thought we might have questions. That's
Oh
why
yes, sorry. Yes, sorry.
You gave me till 3.
No, yes.
So
yes.
I assumed that was
No,
the time.
you're right. You're right.
But
so.
if no one wants a question, we can have a break. So anyone asking a question is keeping everyone else from the break. Measure your responsibilities.
My role here is to make sure everyone works, so I will ask a question. Well, the issue of waterscapes, and you have mentioned several approaches, there are different perceptions about, right? In the end, different human groups see different things and take out of it different things. And when this goes across international policies of preservation, and you gave one example now with Man and Biosphere and recommendations to keep traditional activities inside the parks. This was not only in Africa, in South America. Well, Yellowstone is the model, and Yellowstone is that. But the question is, and I've came across many situations like that in South America, is that the traditional activities are a heavy burden on people. They produce low income. They're very severe in terms of health, of quality of life. It's very intensive labor. And it seems that the only possibility for these people is to be frozen in prehistory, and as you know, I'm a prehistorian, so I don't take it offensively, because if they want to improve their lives, they can't. We have a situation nowadays, for example, in Brazil, with the ecosystem of Cerrado, which is a kind of savanna. And studies have demonstrated that the areas where the Cerrado is better protected in the whole of Brazil are the poorest communities, are those who are deprived of all kinds of social support. They don't have medical doctors, they don't have roads, they don't have anything. This is why the environment is protected. So how do you see this? Because there's a tremendous tension, and we all know about the discussions of Amazonia, for example. When they are seen from the outside, it looks like the government in each moment is trying to destroy Amazon. Then, when the government changes, everything remains the same. Because in the end, the people living in the Amazon need, or want, I don't know if they need, but they want a change, because the alternative is to die young.
Yeah.
So, how do you...
Very good point. And this goes to the heart of some of the problems with traditional ideas of conservation, which is that by focusing on the natural environment as if it wasn't a hybrid natural-human environment, you end up protecting a certain idea of nature at the expense of the humans that cohabit with it. And the question of responsibility cannot be only the responsibility towards the waterscape or the natural world, the fish, the rocks, the beach. It has to be also the responsibilities towards the people who live there. And that tends to be systematically neglected. In the international system, I worked for a specialized UN agency for 18 years, so I know this discourse by heart. But in the international system, the right to development is at the same level as all the other obligations to protect natural environments. And that right to development, as traditionally perceived, clashes with the protection of natural environments. Now, sometimes we try to find ways out of this by saying, yes, but very poor people with demographic growth using firewood as their only source of fuel destroy forests. There's some truth in that, but it's probably wildly exaggerated compared to the actual processes of industrial deforestation. So the attempt to have your cake and eat it by saying what's good for nature is also good for people is sometimes true, and it's probably true in general, on average, for the whole of humanity, but for particular people in particular places, that may not be the case. Think of fishing communities confronted with fishing quotas, which is a very European example. The European Union, in its wisdom, imposes fishing quotas to protect fish stocks, which is fine if you care about fish stocks. But how do fishing communities cope with that? And depending on the country, the general response is, not my problem, they need to retrain as software engineers, or we'll give them lots of money to make them shut up. It won't save fishing, but it will at least save MPs in fishing constituencies. That tends to be more the French approach. The first approach is more the British approach. Neither of them make any kind of sense. First, because none of that actually preserves the communities. Retraining the children of fishermen as software engineers simply guarantees they will leave to live in the capital, and the fishing communities will disappear. And simply paying fishermen not to fish doesn't create fishing communities, it creates subsidized, angry communities. And you see this in farming and in many other areas of life as well. But what do? Do you simply say, leave it to the local knowledge of fishermen to preserve fish stocks? There's some evidence that this works in traditional communities with limited economic pressure. But try doing that in the North Sea, which is open basically to everyone to fish in, even if in theory it isn't, which has been overfished for generations, so that many species such as mackerel and cod are actually severely under threat, and which doesn't really have many alternatives in economic terms, except oil, gas and wind. But oil, gas and wind don't produce the same kind of jobs for the same kind of people. They're not very labor intensive, and they're putting the value chain elsewhere. So I would actually regard this as an extremely important and completely unresolved issue. Putting humans at the heart of environmental sustainability is not fashionable. It's absolutely crucial, and I think a humanities-anchored approach to sustainability, such as the one that CIPSH promotes, including through the Bridges program, is exactly what we need in this context. Because a nature-centered approach to sustainability actually hasn't worked. It can work only, as I mentioned, by the myth of wilderness, which produces some good effects, wolves in Yellowstone maybe, but also produces perverse effects and cannot be replicated at smaller scales. In much of Europe, it's irrelevant. You simply can't do that. Nothing the size of Yellowstone could possibly be created, even if there was a consensus on doing it. So we need to imagine something profoundly different. And culture is the place to start, not something that should be added at the end. I know that's not answering your question, Luis, but it's just showing that I share your question.
I have a question. Yes. Since it's about China and the global perspective, you know, as China were very active and were and are still very active about the water harnessing. For example, Liu, created the Xia dynasty because he harnessed the water, and you have 3 gorges, canals. Now still want to do a dam, in the Tibet. So, from your perspective, what's your comment on this Chinese proactivity? What's your attitude from a Western perspective, perhaps? Yeah. So I'm Chinese. I want to. Yeah.
Good question. I've been largely convinced by the extensive literature on dams, which, coming from the environmental movement broadly understood, including environmental scientists, is very hostile to dams. Dams can produce large amounts of electricity. They can also contribute to the regulation of river flows. But I think there are better ways of regulating rivers and better ways of producing electricity. One of the flashpoints of this is going to be the plan which has existed on paper for many years but hasn't yet attracted finance, and the governance conditions aren't suitable, of building a mega dam of the same scale as the Chinese mega dams on the Congo River in Africa. The actual dam will be located on the territory of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the governance issues, as you can imagine, are not very favorable to massive international finance at the moment. But at some point they might become so. And I think we're talking about something of the region of 18 gigawatts of electrical power for this planned dam, which would, of course, totally transform the hydrological cycle, the forest, for thousands of square kilometers, and obviously completely transform the whole economic system of the region. Would it be a net benefit to humans and the environment, counting both? I'm not sure. I think there are better ways these days. I think dams are the ultimate 20th century technology. Some 20th century technology was great. After all, my pen is 20th century technology. It probably should be maintained. But I'm not sure that mega dams are still a great idea. But again, I'm no specialist. And that's a personal position based on my reading of the literature, including the technical literature. I wouldn't say more than that.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yes, Pierre. In fact, I'd like to come back to the problem of overfishing. Typically in economics, for example, within Mediterranean Sea, of overfishing of tuna, it's we can analyze that in game theory, like Dylan's Prisoner, you know, and we know that the end of Dylan's Prisoner is Nash equilibrium, which means that we can't avoid overfishing because everybody got an incentive to not respecting the quota, to overfish, because there is always solution to go through the quota. And actually it seems that there is no solution to that. Because all the fishers know that which are the consequences of overfishing. They know they are cutting the tree they are sitting on. I can use this image. And they know that if they don't overfish, the other will overfish, and all their efforts are pointless. And we can find the same problem in many situations. I was thinking in vineyards in southeast of France, of if you want to respect water resource, if one people respect the water resource and the other don't, his efforts are pointless. So nobody has an incentive to make this effort. So it seems that economics can't find any solution. In other science, in other social science, do you see any way to go out of this prisoner's dilemma?
Yes. The prisoner's dilemma depends on a key assumption: no communication between the prisoners. And that assumption is sociologically wildly implausible. At the very minimum, the fishing game is a repeated prisoner's dilemma, and repetition is a proxy for communication. But much more importantly, every successful experiment in this area, but they've been done at small scales, I'll come back to that in a moment, has been based on introducing deliberation into the prisoner's dilemma. Once the prisoners can deliberate, things become less determinate, but also much more open. Now, one of the things this means is that when you have a fishing community, it can self-police. There are some great examples from UNESCO programs on this, where fishing exclusion zones, for instance, have been set up, not imposed on local fishermen, but negotiated with them on the basis that fishing exclusion zones, particularly in proximity to mangroves, favor the maintenance of fish stocks because fish breed in mangroves. So if you avoid fishing fish that are too young, you maintain the vitality of the population. Every fisherman knows this, but as you say, there's mutual suspicion between fishermen. If you bring in an external authority to police the exclusion area, everyone cheats. If you build the exclusion area together with the population, they police it collectively. On the other hand, this isn't going to work in the Atlantic, which is international high seas, where non-European vessels are routinely fishing on a very large scale in European economic exclusion zone waters, but not territorial waters. And it definitely can't work in the North Sea, where the whole problem is that the North Sea is a shared space among people who traditionally don't talk to one another. So the answer to the prisoner's dilemma is deliberation. And that comes not from economics, but from sociology, political science, and anthropology. In theory, it's a game changer. Implementing it in practice is tricky.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Now, I suggest that we do a 5 minutes break, okay, just to see a little bit the light and to take coffee if that works. And then we come back for the keynote of Professor Marianne Basile-Bourguière. Okay, so 5 minutes and then we come back. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
next keynote speaker is Marianne Bastide-Bruguère. She's a French sonologist. She's graduated of the École nationale des langues et civilisations orientales at Pekin University. From 1969, she worked for the Centre national de la recherche scientifique. She has also taught at the Institut d'études politiques de Strasbourg, l'École des hautes études et sciences sociales, Paris Diderot University, Harvard University, Seika University, University of London, and the University of Kyoto. She is a reader to the China Quarterly. She's a member of the Académie des sciences morales et politiques, the Society for Asian Studies, the Academia Europaea, and from 1992 to 1996, she was president of the Association Européenne des Études Chinoises. She has received honorary PhDs from the Russian Academy of Science and the University of Aberdeen, and in April 2010, she was named Grand Officier of the Légion d'Honneur. So, Marianne, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I must thank Professor Guimarães and Professor Osterbeck for inviting me, and also my friend Jean Pingen, who is now in the United States. So the title of my paper is "It is Sweet When on the Vast Sea," and it's a few verses from Lucretius. In the Roman world of the 1st century BC, the Epicurean philosopher and poet Lucretius would write about the relation of man and nature. The full quotation of his verses, which are in the first lines of the second book of his long didactic poem of 7,400 verses, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, is as follows in Latin. Suave mari magno turbantibus equora ventis, et terra magnum alterius spectare laborem. Non quia vixari quemquam es jucunda voluptas, sed quibus ipse malis careas, quia cernere suave est. And the meaning is this sweet when on the vast sea the winds roll up its smooth waters to watch from land the deep distress of somebody else. Not that it is a happy delight that anyone should be afflicted, but because it is sweet to see from what evils you are yourself exempt. Lucretius then goes on to say that in order to be safe from natural dangers, man just has to be wise, to get knowledge and understanding of nature, because nature can provide him with all the necessary resources and healings when he feels pain in his own body, whether he's poor or rich as a king. Lucretius was impressed by the infinity of the universe, by the powerful operation of natural forces and the beauty of waters, though he denied that any deity or god was behind that world, creating that world or operating it. His purpose was to explain to his Roman audience the philosophy of Epicurus and to have them trust it in order to live a better life, safe of fears, grievances, and sufferings. The Greek thinker Epicurus was born in 341 BC on the island of Samos, but he was an Athenian citizen and he died in Athens in 270 BC. He taught in a garden which he built there in 306 BC, so that his inclusive school, which was open at that time to women and even to slaves, his school was called the Garden School, Okepos. To Epicurus, the unhappiness of human beings arose largely from the dread which they had of the power of the gods and deities, and from the terror of their wrath. This wrath was supposed to be displayed by the misfortunes inflicted in this life and by the everlasting tortures that were the lot of the guilty at a later stage. Or the wrath of the gods could be shown by a dread of gloom and misery after death. Epicurus wanted to remove these human fears. For this purpose, he borrowed the theory of atomism from Democritus, that is, that the elementary constituents of nature are undifferentiated matter in the form of discrete, solid, and indivisible particles, the atoms, which are below the threshold of perception. He then could demonstrate that the material universe was formed not by any supreme being, but by the mixing of elemental particles which had existed from all eternity and which were governed by certain simple laws. As regards gods and deities, if ever they existed, they were totally indifferent to the world and to its inhabitants. They remained unmoved alike by the virtues and by the crimes of the men. And this means that humans have nothing to fear from the gods. Despite the advocacy of empiricism and the many correct conjectures about atomism and the nature of the physical world, the account of natural phenomena in the poem cannot be regarded as a truly scientific contribution. In this regard, the errors are many. The naturalistic explanations given by Lucretius are meant to bolster the ethical and philosophical ideas of Epicurus and not to reveal true explanations of the physical world. Through this approach, the Latin poet also teaches man how to live with nature in good understanding. He teaches not to be afraid by nature, not to try to suppress nature, but to adapt to it and develop it while leaving it an adequate freedom. In ancient China, and still in many traditions, practices, and concerns in today's China, we can find in a similar way a most detailed observation of every aspect of natural life on earth and in heavens, and of man's relations to it. But my talk will not delve long on this huge topic, since several special papers by most knowledgeable and distinguished speakers, Professor Chen Xia, Professor Li Zhuhong, Professor Violaine Escan, Professor Gilbert Fong, Professor Liao Xianhao, Professor Huang Xinya, Professor Desmond Hui, Professor Michael Meadows, Professor Sun Xiaochun, and Dr. Lu Yang will be presenting later on this conference papers on this subject. I shall just raise a few points, and then I shall switch to two issues. The first is what recent research in the humanities and social sciences does tell us about the management of water across centuries. And the second question is, how could these scholarly achievements be efficiently used, not simply to warn everyone about danger, but to induce people everywhere to efficiently, daily, in their behavior, to save and upkeep water resources around the earth. Let us first take a glimpse of the Chinese waterscape through the ages. In many cultures all over the world can be found a reminiscence, a legend, or a myth about a cataclysmic flooding in a very distant past. This flooding engulfed all human communities and their belongings far away, leaving only very few survivors. Over 600 of such myths have been identified and studied so far. In the Amerindian tradition, lone man who created the earth built a wall made of wood and was able to save one village from the catastrophe inflicted by a powerful devil which he killed. By the Maya tradition, a rain of fire destroyed a whole human race made of wood, and that race was replaced by the present race of sweet corn men. India and the ancient Middle East have many tales or myths that are close to the flood narrative in the Genesis, the first chapter of the Bible, which was composed in the 5th century BC. China also has her flood, told in the Shanghai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, which version is from the 2nd century BC. This book, the Shanghai Jing, is a fabulous geographical and cultural account of China before the foundation of a united empire in the late 3rd century BC. The terrible flood is told also from that source by the great historian Sematien in the Shedi, the historical records, which is a masterpiece in Chinese literature. That is by the end of the 2nd century BC. These texts tell how Yu the Great, a legendary king of the Xia dynasty, spent years trying to control the havoc caused by the deluge and to prevent such widespread damage to happen again. However, the Chinese deluge is quite different from the biblical deluge and other mythic big floods around the world. Firstly, the flood in China is not described as a punishment for human mistakes or misconduct. And that is amazing because all along Chinese history, climatic disorders, severe droughts and floods are claimed to be a punishment from heaven for human breaches of morality, thus leading the population and authorities to special religious processions, ceremonies, and offerings in the various temples. Secondly, the Chinese flood is said to be high waters that rise up to the sky and put people in hardship, but do not kill people. And thirdly, and most importantly, the outcome of the Chinese flood is quite different from the biblical account. In the Bible, once the water went out, Noah let the animals which he had taken in out of his boat, and himself and his family just settle down and take up again growing wheat and raising cattle as usual. But in China, Kun, one imperial prince, is put in charge to control the waters and recover the territories covered by the waters. As he fails to achieve the task, the wise Emperor Shun puts in charge Kun's son, Yu, who is later called the Great and inherits the emperorship. And Yu succeeds in the space of 9 years in bringing the waters under control by means of constant assiduity and method. The Chinese character for this achievement is very telling and interesting, and remains a key word in Chinese political vocabulary and social practice. This character is zhi, and it has 3 points, which are which means the water in front of the character. You divided the flow and channeled it through a network of canals that irrigated the fields and ultimately flowed into the sea or into some lakes. He did not obstruct the waters. He did not lock them in behind walls. He guided them to provide the best use for soil fertility, and he let them free to spread in the sea and lakes after they had filled their task of fertilizing the fields for agriculture. This way of managing natural elements is an outstanding feature of Chinese culture, a feature which applies as well to the political sphere, to social relations, to intellectual or moral pursuits. It is a guided freedom, quite different from the ideas of taming, of conquest, of domination, or direct power, or in Latin, imperium, which are so common in European tradition, for instance. It is another way of wielding authority. We can find this way strongly embedded in Taoist thought and in Confucian thought. That does not mean that Chinese history and society are entirely free of willful violence and arbitrariness. But to come back to a longer perspective on the Chinese management of waterscapes, I wish to refer to the seminal book edited by Mark Elvin and Liu Zuizhong. Liu Zuizhong, a scholar from Taiwan, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 1998 under the title Sediments of Time and Environment and Society in Chinese History. The contributions by the editors and other authors put light on the shift of priorities in the costly management of the Yellow River, from defense against floods and hydrological instability, together with the needs of transport for trade, a shift to urgent military concerns in the Song period, while in the late Ming there was a clear consciousness that the diverging interests all along the Yellow River, including providing enough water for the Grand Canal, required a balance of action over time. The Qing administration in the 18th century did develop a global vision not only of the management of waters, but also of the whole environment, with a clear perception of the scarcity and limits of natural resources, as well as of the potentially damaging impact of human activities on natural processes. In the 18th and 19th century, the natural and economic environment changed weekly in China, and instead of big projects, the state administration turned to small projects. In literature and among the educated society, love of nature focused at that time no more on wilderness, the big rocks you see on some painting, but on gardens, on a subdued nature. Today, on the contrary, China has engaged huge projects on the main rivers, those from Himalaya, the Tibetan Sinai Plateau, and the whole Yangtze River basin, which with over 58 trillion yuan GDP accounts now for 46.7% of national GDP. The basin of the Yangtze is now a strategic freshwater reservoir for China through monumental projects like south to north water diversion. The basin, the abundant water of the basin resources are channeled to vast areas beyond the basin, and they safeguard the national water security. The basin connects through rail and roads the Silk Road economic belt and the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Furthermore, the basin serves as a major hydropower base. It is endowed with rich wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal energy, which enhance its status as a critical zone for China's new energy development. However, the acceleration of climatic accidents show that much more has to be done everywhere, despite local resistance to the financial and other burdens involved. For instance, when heavy rains raged across northern China this summer, that old city in Shanxi province, which is best known as the home of the Yungan Grottoes, a World Heritage Site, Datong escaped disaster despite almost 20 hours of upstream flood discharges, and residents there said it was saved thanks to the work of the former mayor, who spearheaded a project to widen the city's main waterway and reinforce its banks during his time of office more than 15 years ago. and many people at that time were forced to relocate because of the project. And back now, and they were resented it a lot. But now, they consider it was not a waste, because the city has been saved. At that time, they said that it was stupid because it rained very little in that time. They realized that investment in climate resilient infrastructure, like flood control system, which had been slowed down in the last 10 years, is now speeding up after the Ragasa typhoon in Guangdong and several inland cities which have been very badly inundated recently. The concept of building what is called sponge cities in Chinese has long been discussed, but with no rush to push ahead with large-scale infrastructure construction. China's National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy 2035 was issued in 2022, including many grand projects and another multi-year plan in 2024 with 800 billion yuan for this year, 2025, with major water conservancy projects and upgrades to urban underground pipelines and networks. But a recent report stated that nothing has been started, and that from an emphasis on engineering solutions, a more systemic approach, including monitoring, ecological conservation, and emergency response, would be promoted with attention to tailoring disaster prevention policies to the development conditions of different regions. There is now obvious reluctance to invest in infrastructures that do not yield a net profit. A recent research in the humanities and social sciences has brought us much new knowledge about the management of water across centuries in various parts of the world. The most recent scientific studies have established that the total volume of water on Earth is 1,386 cubic kilometers. And this amount does not vary. It takes 2,700 years for the hydrosphere, that is all the water present in the earth, to be wholly renewed. Oceans and seas make 98% of the total volume. And it is the oceans which are the driving force of the cycle. But part of the water is temporarily stored in many continental reservoirs, in the lakes, the glaciers, and the rivers. And this geographical distribution is always varying, resulting in frequent shortages or excess. Facing such variability, human societies have always tried to master it. But today, their interventions must take into account ecological requirements and the limits of global balance. Recently, historians everywhere have conducted painstaking, thorough research in the line of what is called by historians the space turn in historiography. And this research is in order to find out how far different approaches and methods have been used to cope with water problems that were their logic, their interaction, their results for the local communities and beyond. These works showed that monitoring the waterscape had been all along a concern and a task carefully performed by local communities with supervision of local officials and regular communication with other communities in the same area. This work would produce a technical literature shared with those neighboring villages, and the information was eventually collected by a higher official or well-educated gentry and went to print. It was circulated, at least at provincial level, and sometimes nationally, in book form or in a periodical. This accumulated knowledge and practice later fed the larger land reclamation projects, and the recent historical studies showed that while the forest had suffered its substantial destructions in many parts of the world, during the Middle Ages and until the 18th century, it had now recovered, especially in Europe, and extended more than ever in many places. The health of the forest and its sustainability have been improved, and the inhabitants are sharing again in the care and protection of the forest, of the ponds and the rivers around. Knowledge and action are thus tightly linked together and enriching each other. Part of the new research work on past ecology deals with the colonial empire's territories. Actually, it is in those lands with such different climate, vegetation, and animals compared to the homeland of the colonizers that the officials became quickly aware of the need to change the rules and protect the local resources. The Dutch and British colonies enjoyed gorgeous botanical gardens long before their metropolitan capitals. The first urgent calls to protect the tropical forest and not to fell trees wantonly came from the early colonizers dismayed by the devastation of soils, the scarcity of arable land, and the death toll on a starving population. In the same way, the accumulated knowledge and know-how of this early period has fed the progress of agronomy and land conservation before and after the independence era. Recent studies like the book Water Warriors by Andrew Marter, published at Cornell University in 2017, and China's Green Consensus by Virginie Arantes at Routledge in 2022, those books also show that in authoritarian regimes, environment urgency can be used as an instrument to neutralize the social tensions arising from unequal distribution of water between villages and urban residents, or even the tensions because of the spoliation of large regions in China in favor of Peking. Another trend in recent historiography has brought some special light on waterscapes management, but rather on a negative way. That is, research on gender history, because women are rarely involved in those waterscape management. Both environmental history and women's history, along with gender history later on, were institutionalized in the United States in the early 1970s. Paradoxically, however, there has been little dialogue between these two fields until recently, as has been pointed out more generally with regard to environment history and social history. Yet these two fields of historical scholarship have shared a common goal from the outset, that was to give a voice and agency to those forgotten in official history. The aim of this research was to take on new subjects of study, the women, or more ambitiously, to reinterpret the past in terms of gender power relations or environment issues. Against the backdrop of struggles for civil rights and gender equality, as well as the development of environment movements, a sometime militant academic commitment was another feature, and these two currents had in common. Some 30 years later, environment historians sought to provide their field with a theoretical framework to demonstrate its centrality to history as a discipline and to the social sciences more broadly. Gender history, then, has provided a template for those who wanted to treat the environment as a category or analysis comparable to race, class, and gender, in order to uncover power relations and asymmetries. However, the intersection between gender history and environment history has remained relatively limited to date, particularly outside the English-speaking world and beyond Indian historiography, despite repeated calls to integrate gender perspectives into the conceptual apparatus of environment history. Work in this area over the past 20 years has mainly focused on North America, reflecting the dual American tradition in these two fields of history, and it has also focused on India, where the convergence of social and environment issues has been central to subaltern studies. This research has largely given priority to the contemporary era, and furthermore, in the English-speaking world, a significant proportion of these studies have the specificities of US history. to the detriment of considering the roles of women, of indigenous peoples and enslaved populations. Concerning the latter academic accounts, they have often focused on environment struggles and the preservation of botanical or agricultural knowledge that colonization would have dispossessed them of. Beyond the historical discipline, the use of gender as an analytical tool cannot be considered in isolation from other relationships of domination and from other modes of assignment, such as race or class. Research on environment injustices has simply demonstrated the intersections and convergence between environment and social inequalities, including gender discrimination. And this has highlighted discrepancies in access to and in control of natural resources, as well as related environment changes in various contexts. Numerous studies in the humanities and social sciences have also revealed antagonistic forms of relationship with the environment, those forms based on different conceptions of nature. The following opposition has been particularly emphasized. On the one hand, white Western male elites tend to view nature as a resource which you can appropriate and an enclosed space in need of protection. On the other hand, exploited minorities, especially women in poorer countries, see the natural world as a common good and an integrated whole, of which the human species is merely a part. At the crossroads of ecological struggles and the fight for women's rights, academic ecofeminism has for half a century sought to deconstruct the interconnected dominations of women and nature, while it was seeking to avoid the pitfall of essentialism. Recent gendered reinterpretations of the Anthropocene encourage us to make visible the marginalized groups, including women, excluded from positions of power, and therefore often reduced at best to real victims of environmental damage. Another approach is to examine the causes of the environment crisis in order to highlight the patriarchal determinants of the degradation of the living world. A large conference will be held in France, in Aix-Marseille, next June, that will integrate gender history and environment history with the aim, firstly, to highlight approaches that have remained relatively marginal in France, despite having been debated for several decades elsewhere, particularly in the English-speaking world. And secondly, the conference aims to empirically investigate these approaches through case studies ranging from antiquity to the present day, given the fact that contemporary history still dominates the historiography of gender-environment relations. The value of such an approach in the eyes of the organizers lies not only in reintegrating women as environment actors in their own right into historical analysis, it also raises the issue of the sources required to access silenced voices and to bring to light forms of knowledge and practices that have been largely overlooked. Most importantly, it involves considering gender as an essential lens composed of habits, social norms, behaviors, which vary across time and space, through which a lens through which individuals' relationships with the rest of nature are constructed. Mobilizing concepts that are important to both fields, such as agency, allows to question in a dialectical way the impact of gender, understood as the social construction of sex differences and the associated power relations, the power and the impact of gender on the environment. It also enables to consider the reverse, the effect of the relationship with nature on social gender relations. From this perspective, gender history can inform environmental history, encouraging us to re-examine from the margins grand narratives such as those concerning domestication, slavery, colonization, scientific revolutions, the rise of capitalism, and industrialization. This approach also invites us to take a fresh look at classical themes that have recently been revisited, such as labor, the commons, or environmental protection, and even to explore new areas of research. Reflection will focus on both the materiality of the relationships that historical actors maintain with their environment, for instance, access to natural resources and the effects of their action on environments, and socio-environment dynamics. And it will also focus on the gender norms that shape these relationships, or that these relationships in turn have to construct or conform. In conclusion, how can this scholarship help to decide on better policies, and how can it help to teach people to behave in a responsible way in their daily life? On September 24, at the UN meeting, over 100 countries have pledged to do more to keep the goals of the COP30. A UN World Water Development Report has been published in March this year. It highlights that billions have no access to wash. Fetching water is women's task in many places. And toilets, they have even statistics for toilets all over the world. Toilets, in fact, are rare. Now, how should we behave in a rather rich country? Should we eat less? Should we wash less? Should we let our laundry dirty? Across centuries, the knowledge and styles of management of the human relations to nature have changed all the time, but they always combined attempts at full domestication and some kind of careful adaptation. It is probably in this line of this ancestral search for thoughtful adaptation that today humanities and social sciences could help us to keep the waterscape needed by human life on Earth. But I must say that in the schools in our countries, the children are not taught even not to let the tap open after they go to the toilet and so on. I mean, and even for our food, we see a lot of diverging instruction of whether you should eat chicken, or should you eat veal, or should you eat beef. I don't know in which instance a kind of global regulation, a precise regulation for everyday life should be written down. But I think this is needed. And even, I must say, when I talk with my friends in the Academy of Science, I ask them, may I still burn wood in my chimney? And they told me it doesn't matter at all. It will. And I was surprised because I had started not to buy to burn wood for 2 years, and now I know I can do it. So I think it's very simple things, and also the opinion of the scientists are quite different. And I wonder whether inside UNESCO there are circles of kind of cells which can get together and decide or at least propose that for a zone which will be in Europe, because if I don't drink water, it doesn't give water to the little child in the middle of Africa. So there must be rules, some kind of a kind of very simple agenda which will be different for the different part of the world. So I'm sorry I've been too long. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
No, they're tied at the end of the day.
Well,
Yes.
thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I think you addressed a little bit what John an hour ago ended his speech. That is responsibility. So do you think that we do have certain kind of shared responsibility, particularly responsibility is not just an ethical issue, but rather a political issue? In other words, it involves certain power structure. How would we address this responsibility issue in the global scale when you talk about water?
First, I mean, the people who know most about water, it just happened that 2 weeks ago, we had somebody who told us about that, and we asked a lot of questions about that. And they don't know. Because they can measure how much water there is, and what are the potential for catastrophe, as what happened this summer, and that kind of thing. But the way to regulate the behavior and the individual behaviors, because it's all made of every person is responsible for that. But the way to give rules which make sense, which can be applied, there is nobody to do it. And I think there should be probably, maybe in UNESCO because it's international, and the rules must not be the same for the little boy in the middle of Africa and for the little boy in the middle of Paris. I mean, it doesn't make sense. So you must have areas to tell the people that's how you should behave. Put your heat only, that was done in France, but it's not, you are not compelled to do it, of course. In fact, what happened from the observation from our electrical company, the people who applied the rules were people, the older people, because in their childhood, that's the case for me, there was not much electricity. And in my grandparents' house in the countryside, there was no current water. There was only a well, and you had to go to the well and take the water. So you would spare it. And this I'm accustomed to do. But on the contrary, I see my grandchildren, when they leave a room, the light is still open. I come behind so there is a question of generation, and also people who have lived in countries where the level of the standard of living is low. They are accustomed to spare, to save, and so on. But I think rules should be given, and I think that in schools, for very simple things, the children should be taught from the first year to respect some rules. I don't know whether we...
Yeah. My question basically is about, your generation and our generation probably experienced that scarcity, of water.
Yeah.
But nowadays, the younger generation take water as a kind of convenient, occurrence,
Well,
right? If this is not their precarious experience, they don't feel that vulnerability.
No, but...
Yeah, so how is that education can be carried out to the younger generation?
But I think you can show them films.
Right.
And they're always on the...
Right, precisely. That's
on
what
the
imagination.
smartphone, they can see how it is elsewhere.
Right.
And also, even in our countries, they can be taken to places where old people are in a bad situation and don't have much, and they will understand.
Yeah.
I think it's showing people and having people do things also. And I think it could be done in every small district and so on.
Right. I totally agree. Yes. That
No,
education
it's
is
not
important.
something which the president can decide.
No,
No, it should be done on the ground.
that's right.
And in the past, if you see all these works which have mentioned, which have been done now of real research of how it worked in the old days, it was all on the ground, very practical. And I think that the way it can work, because you see the result immediately. Yeah.
Just one thing. We are quite constrained by time, and so just one question, and then we have to, because we have this van speaking at is up at 17:10, and we have the boat at 6:30. They will not wait for us. Okay. And so one more question, and then we go upstairs and we can continue the conversation, because we go upstairs for a drink and we can continue the conversation. So
thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring. I just have one question, because you said that the rule cannot be the same in every part of the world. And when I hear your what you say also about the way we have to behave, it seems to me that the frugality, or what you mentioned also about the consciousness of scarcity, is something that we can all share. Even in France, we have experiments. The fact that water is not anymore everywhere. So why this rule about, this consideration of frugality cannot be a rule that we share, even if we are not in the same place of the world?
This consideration of what?
Of, the fact that we have to be frugal, frugal or sober in the way we use water. Why can this not be a kind of universal rule?
J'entends pas, excusez-moi, mais dites plus fort.
Je dis en français.
Oui, dites-le plus fort.
J'ai été étonnée du fait que vous avez dit que les règles devaient être différentes si on est à Paris ou si on est au milieu de l'Afrique. Et je me demande pourquoi la règle de la sobriété ne peut pas être une règle universelle.
Because you cannot impose the same tax of sobriety. On a woman in Africa who has no current water, you cannot tell her she has to go to the well to get. So, and if you tell her you can drink only, 10 liters a day, she drinks only 1 liter, so it doesn't make sense. It should be adapted, and there are certain rules which probably in Africa you don't need to have, because
I understand.
The conditions are such that they do not make sense. But there are other rules which we do not need because it's safer or so on, and they need it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think it should be local.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
But it's not easy to do, because I think it's a kind of movement which from place to place, because imitation. They did it, so we are going to do it, but we do it in our way. So I think it's we should do that.
Thank you.
Merci. So I invite you all now to go upstairs for a quick drink, because then we have to leave at 10 past to meet the taxi. So you just follow my colleague upstairs. So that while you go out, there is a program here, the food program paper. So if you want to take one, okay, it's here. Plus the plans for this